Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to this national webinar, Building Trust and Fostering Sustainable Collaboration Across Higher Education Institutions, with examples from Michigan and Texas. My name is Rich Pirog. I'm the director for the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems. This webinar is sponsored by the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems and also the National Racial Equity in the Food Systems Work Group. Next slide. We're just going to provide just a little bit of information about our two sponsors before we ask you a poll question and talk about the agenda of the webinar. For those of you that are not familiar with the center, we're at Michigan State University. We've been in business for about almost 10 years. We have a number of food system specialists that work much like cooperative extension specialists working in different content areas. Our content areas cover a wide range of areas in food systems, including food hubs and food policy councils, and on racial equity and the intersection of racial equity and food systems. Next slide. The webinar is also co-sponsored by the Racial Equity in the Food Systems Work Group. These are members of the National Committee, representing, most of them are higher education educators across the country. This group, the Racial Equity in the Food Systems Work Group, is a community of predominantly, but not exclusively, cooperative extension professionals. We do have some public and private universities and some other individuals. But we're a community of professionals and stakeholders who connect, learn, and collaborate to facilitate change within our institutions and society and to build racial equity within the food system. We'll go to our next slide. So it's now time for an opening poll question so we can give our panelists a better idea of who is joining them. I'm going to open up the poll, and the question is, what type of institution are you affiliated with? Some of you may be affiliated with more than one institution, so we'll ask you to put your primary affiliation in the response. So only pick one response. So the poll is now opened. What type of institution are you affiliated with? Select the type that is your primary affiliation if you have more than one. Yes, and thanks for one of our participants. There's an extra blank question I may have screwed up that folks have to answer in order to submit. So you may need to answer that blank question just so we can see your results. Please do that. Thank you. Thank you, Lillian. Okay. I'm going to end poll here and share the results. So thank you again for participating in the poll. About 60% of our participants are from 1862 land grants, and much smaller percentages from 1994 tribal colleges, other public and private universities, about 14% from nonprofits and other institutions such as government, K-12, and business. So thank you very much again for participating in the poll. So we'll go to the next slide, Rachel. So I'm going to hand off the facilitator for this rest of this webinar is Keweenaw Souza. Keweenaw is with the Center for Regional Food Systems at Michigan State University. She's the center's food systems equity and advocacy specialist. She's been with the center for about 14 months. Keweenaw has worked extensively in food systems in the state of Kansas and in consulting work in Kansas and elsewhere. She has worked with the Kansas State Extension and has done consulting work in Kansas. And Kalia will again be your facilitator and will facilitate not only the panelists, but also the discussion part of the webinar. So thank you, and over to you, Kalia.
All right, thanks, Rich. So the land-grant university system is a complex network of partnerships between federal, state, and local governments serving communities the nation over. And collaboration among the 1862, 1890, and 1994 colleges and universities, as well as Hispanic serving agricultural colleges and universities, is a critical ingredient for both institutional and community capacity building. Today, you'll be hearing examples of collaboration across the land-grant university system. First, from Texas Prairie View A&M, an 1890 historically Black university, and Baylor College of Medicine, a private institution, followed by Michigan and its three 1994 tribal colleges, Bay Mills, Saginaw Chippewa, and Keweenaw Bay. Throughout this webinar, our presenters will also engage you all in the chat box, but we encourage you to utilize the Q&A box to ask questions specific to our presenters. We'll leave time at the end of the presentation to address your questions, but our presenters may also answer some questions directly in the Q&A box, pending how many questions you all have for them and how we're doing on time. And as a reminder, this webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording and presentation slides will be shared several days after the webinar. Next slide, please. So as you listen to the stories being told today, we hope to impress upon you all the value of building relationships across higher ed partners first and at the outset, and also at the speed of trust as opposed to the will of grant timelines. Next slide. Now for introductions. Our first panelists join us from Prairie View A&M and Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Carolyn J. Williams is a native of Palestine, Texas. Her roots in extension began when her mother enrolled her and two younger brothers in the 4-H program in her home county in Texas. She is the Executive Associate Director of the Cooperative Extension Program at Prairie View A&M and provides statewide administrative oversight and accountability to the 4 program areas: agriculture and natural resources, 4-H youth development, community and economic development, and family and community health in 35 Texas counties. Prior to transferring to Prairie View A&M University, she worked in 5 Texas counties as an extension agent with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Carolyn has served as the chair of the Association of Extension Administrators and chair of the ECOP Program Committee, lead 21 board member. Presently, she serves on the Texas Coming Together for Racial Understanding Task Group and the 1890 Foundation Board. She received her BS and MS degrees from Prairie View A&M University in Home Economics Education and her PhD from Texas A&M University in Agricultural Education. Jacqueline White is the program leader of Family and Community Health for the Cooperative Extension Program at Prairie View A&M University. She provides leadership to the family and community health staff, including extension agents, program specialists, nutrition education associates, program coordinators, and other staff members. Her family and community health unit conducts workshops focusing on nutrition, health and wellness, mental health, parenting, money management, and cyberbullying. She serves on various local, state, and national committees, including the Association of Extension Administrators Nutrition Team for the 1890 University System, and has extensive experience in working with limited resource individuals and families. We also have Jana Dave, an assistant professor at the USDA ARS Children's Nutrition Research Center at Baylor College of Medicine. She is a nutritionist and a behavioral scientist, and her work focuses on addressing health disparities as it relates to obesity and chronic disease prevention among children and parents from low-income, racial ethnic minority populations through research and training. She's been funded through federal agencies, including the National Institutes of Health and USDA, on several projects focusing on effects of food insecurity and participation in food assistance programs on nutrition and health outcomes, and community engaged approaches to population health, including design, implementation, and evaluation of interventions in preschool, K-12 schools, and family and community-based settings such as food banks and food pantries. With that said, Texas, please kick us off.
Thank you so much, Kalia, and thank you all of our participants for joining this very enlightening and relevant conversation. I would like to credit my tenure and rewarding experience to the amazing leaders that I have met along my extension journey. As you heard, I have been on this journey over 40 years, working for two of the best amazing land grant institutions in Texas. But most of all, I also am appreciative to life for the challenges, the failures, and the successes that have made me into who I am today. And to be able to share with such an elite group is truly an honor. However, in order for us to be successful where we are, we have had great mentors and great leaders along the way. And true leadership must lead to change that transforms into social betterment for all of our people. And I really applaud the 1862, 1890s, 1994, and private institutions for having the passion for betterment of all people. And because the 1890 institutions and other institutions have been underfunded for decades, we are very intentional about seeking partnerships and collaborations. We seek to develop relationships within industry, educational institutions, youth serving and professional organizations, mainly because it can be a key strategy for success and lessen the impact of lack of resources while benefiting all parties involved. As we look at our nation today, there are so many issues going on that need our attention, need our passion. And the only way to address these and make a difference is to work together. We appreciate all of the long-term and the short-lived partnerships that we have established here at Texas Cooperative Extension. And I strongly believe that each of us were created with a specific purpose to work together to make a difference. However, to do this, you must be deliberate in building relationships. You must seek out and be available, approachable to start relationships. And then if there are others who are not wanting to start a relationship or a partnership, you just need to move on to the next one that is willing. Always make connections with individuals that have like minds or passion about the same topics and the cultures, the environments, communities that you have a passion for. And please be authentic in your seeking to start relationships and partnerships, because sooner or later, your action will reveal the true motives. And that's where we want to make sure that they are true and the relationships are benefiting all involved. So I will kind of end there and allow my amazing colleagues to continue to share the successes that we have had with this university and private entity relationship. So Dr. White and Dr. Dave.
Good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. We'll first have a chat question for you, and we would like for you to answer that question. According to you, what is the most important attribute of a successful collaboration? I see someone stating communication and trust and listening to one another, open-mindedness, willingness to listen, and transparency. And all of those are some key responses to building an authentic relationship and being able to work together. Clarity of mission, roles and responsibilities. Someone mentioned a clear communication, listening and asking questions. And those are some of the things that we have done and the way that we've built some of our relationships with the College Baylor College of Medicine with Dr. Davi. And did you have any comments there, Dr. Davi, on these chat questions, chat responses?
Oh, I think these are great. Everyone, although we asked for one particular attribute, I think we're getting most of what we've been looking at and working on over the last few years. So this is great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about the Cooperative Extension Program. We're an 1890 institution, and we work within ag and natural resources, 4-H and youth development, family community science, community health, as well as 4-H and community and economic development. One of the things that we see that's most important are our families, and that's where Dr. Davi and I actually started working with, developing our relationship. We are in 35 counties, and Dr. Davi and I have been working with some of my staff members in family community health in all of the 18 counties that my staff is located in. Next slide.
All right, so I'm from the USDA ARS Children's Nutrition Research Center, which is administered by the Department of Pediatrics at Baylor in cooperation with the Texas Children's Hospital. And we are one of the 6 USDA Human Nutrition Research Centers across this country. And some of the areas that we study are nutritional metabolism in mother, infants, and children, pediatric clinical nutrition, obesity prevention, developmental determinants of obesity in infants and children, and molecular, cellular, and regulatory aspects of nutrition during development. Me particularly, I work in the obesity prevention area, when we study we study on identifying behavioral and environmental factors that influence development of children's eating habits, and then work closely with the families to help adopt those healthier habits. Next slide, please.
Collaboration, the Cooperative Extension Program and the Children Nutrition Research Center at Baylor. We've been collaborating for actually over 7 years now. And this has been an ongoing partnership. Baylor has assisted us in so many ways as being an 1890. And within my unit specifically in helping with writing grants, we've received 2 grants actually. One being a capacity building grant that we have worked with our expanded food and nutrition education program staff in Harris, Fort Bend, and Starr County, as well as we just received another grant covering our SNAP Ed. And some of the programming and trainings that Baylor has offered for the staff members to look at qualitative data, giving them training. Dr. Davi, would you like to discuss some more of those trainings?
Sure. So that particular, so we started our work with submitting grants because both Jackie at Prairie and myself, we had common goals in mind, and which was serving the limited resource and underserved families. And I was the one who approached her for one of the grants that I was submitting, where I wanted to work with families in some of the rural counties, and she was she was just so approachable and respectful of what we wanted to do. And that's how we started our collaboration. And the first grant that we got funded on was through USDA, which was a capacity building grant to enhance program delivery of FNAP. And when we talk about program delivery, we're talking about, making sure that what we are doing is correct over time. And so evaluation was one of the main things in there. And for the evaluation, we trained the staff, the extension staff for qualitative interviews, where how to do interviews, how to do the coding of the interviews and analyze the data, which would give you which would give rich information to change or to revise the curriculum that you're teaching. We also train them on doing anthropometric measurements, as well as some of the other aspects of, doing, conducting surveys, anonymous surveys, as well as 24-hour recalls. And then with the grants and programming, that's an ongoing thing that we are, I think we've submitted at least 8 to 10 grants together by now, and it has been a very enriching experience for both of us, I think.
Absolutely. And I must say that the FNEP staff they call on me and say different things about what they learned during the trainings that Dr. Davie and her colleagues at Baylor has taught and trained. And it's been amazing to work with them. They know her personally. It's not just me working with Dr. Davie, but all of the FNEP staff know her and know Jana, and ask questions and still can call upon her whenever there are other questions that are needed. So we're still working together. This is nothing that came and left. It's been in development over the 7 years. Friendships, working relationships, all of those things started to develop. And we can call on each other when times are going, we don't know what's going on with this grant, but we need some more clarity, and we can ask her questions. And that's why we keep on working together, because of the relationship that has been developed over the 7 years. The next slide, please. Some of the things that you all mentioned in the chat pod, working towards a common goal. We've developed the trust, the friendship, the honesty, sharing of resources. So it's not just what I need, but it's also what they need. We've had several of her colleagues within the Baylor College of Medicine, who has called upon the CEP staff to get information as well. Loyalty, it's not always about who gets the most money out of the grant, because we're both working for the same common goal. And we work with limited resource clientele, and we realize that many of them are suffering with their diet, with their health, sometimes even mentally, and it shows up within the foods and nutrition that they eat. So all of these types of things play together. We have integrity, we have respect, and we communicate. We have the understanding for each one of us as to what our goals and needs are. And not only working with Dr. Davie, she has actually put me in communication with others within Baylor who need some of the same goals, working with cancer, working with parents. That's another grant that we submitted just recently together. So any other comments, Dr. Jana?
No, that's it. You covered it all, Jack. Thank you.
Yes, it's been a wonderful working relationship. I must say, we've worked with some 1862s along the way, but working with Jana right here in the Houston area at Baylor College of Medicine, Children Nutrition Research Center has been very rewarding for, I think, both of us. Dr. Williams, do you have any comments as well?
I just want to commend you all for this amazing partnership that has benefited so many people that we will never really know the impact and outreach because of this partnership. So I commend you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Want to turn it back over to Scalia. Yes.
Yep, thank you. So next slide, please. All right, thank you, Carolyn, Jacqueline, and Jana. We're now going to switch gears to Michigan. With us are Emily Proctor, MSW, a citizen elected official of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians, or LTBB, Harbor Springs, Michigan. Emily serves as a tribal extension educator with the Community Food and Environment Institute for Michigan Tribal Nations and Community Partners. Her home office is in Little Traverse Bay Band's homelands, Emmett County, Michigan State University Extension. As a tribal extension educator, her projects include educational programs in the areas of tribal governance, diversity, facilitation, and youth leadership. She's also the project manager for the Michigan Intertribal Land Grant System, or MILES, which is the next step in building the foundation for a seamless, integrated, and intentional land grant system in Michigan, serving all Michigan tribal nations, tribal colleges, and communities. Steve Yanni serves as land grant director for Bay Mills Community College, or BMCC, a tribally controlled college located in Upper Michigan along the shores of Lake Superior. As such, he oversees the college's efforts as a 1994 land grant institution. Current areas of focus include continued development of BMCC's Waishkee Bay Farm as a teaching, research, and incubator facility, focusing on sustainable agriculture and food production that is consistent with traditional Anishinaabe values. Development of academic programs in sustainable agriculture, community development, and health promotion efforts, overseeing BMCC's Mukwa Health and Fitness Education Center, and assisting with the evolution of the Michigan Intertribal Land Grant Extension System. Steve also serves as BMCC's liaison with the Higher Learning Commission, coordinates research efforts by and with BMCC, and represents 1994 institutions on APLU's Policy Board of Directors. Steve earned his PhD from Michigan State University in 2001 and has been working with the Bay Mills Indian community in various capacities for 22 years. Prior to working with Bay Mills, Steve was a faculty member for 18 years at Lake Superior State University and worked for Michigan State University as a county extension director. Michigan, take it away.
Miigwech for the introductions, and we do have a question for you as well to take a few moments to respond. And that question is, have you ever attended a tribal community event such as a powwow? So please take a few moments to think about community events, and if not, if there's other events you have attended, please share those with us as well. Great. All right. Miigwech for the introductions. Emily Proctor, O'Dayman-Quay, Indigenous, McGeezy, and Dodom, Cross Village, Lansing, and Donjaba, Harbor Springs, Enda. So I introduced myself in a very, in our traditional way, in Anishinaabe Moan. I am known as Strawberry Woman in our community. I am Eagle Clan, and I come from Cross Village and Lansing, Michigan, and I currently live in Harbor Springs with my partner and 2 dogs and a cat. And next slide, please. And you'll notice in the center is the skode, so fire. Our skode represents unity, deliberation, collaboration, ceremony, and the sacred. You may see this when working with tribes, such items as this, or such logos. Everything has a purpose. You'll notice that this particular slide has a circle. Everything around the circle is equal. Everything has a place. Everyone is heard. And you can make a change to the size of the group. All are welcome. You'll notice there are 12 logos, including 4 in each direction, cardinal direction. Those are the 1862 and 1994s. So whenever we are partnering, having discussions, please note that the fire itself represents many different ways to bring in diverse perspective. Unity, it brings in each of our nations and communities to bring in the full depth of conversation, right? Michigan and Anishinaabe share common cultural practices and language, again called Anishinaabe Moan. You heard a little bit of that a moment ago. All tribal nations share common ties to the land. The tribes have their own unique structure of government, as well as political identities that vary from village to village. It is vital to deliberately engage in deliberation with tribal leaders, elders, youth, and community members who are determined by each nation and community. It is this intentional activity that contributes to trust building, to long-term sustainability. to the building of a process of sharing power from the very beginning. The efforts to reach out to tribal nations and communities here in Michigan began several years prior to my arrival at MSU Extension. Those positions held are the MSU Native American Institute and historically a tribal liaison position under Michigan State University Extension. Since that time, we have grown in our staffing to include the position I hold as a tribal extension educator, where I work primarily not only with Miles, but good governance, tribal governance, and leadership community engagement. We also have a FERTEP position, right? So you'll notice that with deliberation, with communication, as a result of Miles as well, we've been able to work with Bay Mills Community College, in addition to Bay Mills Indian Community, to create a shared position of a tribal extension educator in the Health and Nutrition Institute. So again, working together, taking that time to actively listen, to know that I always approach my work as the perspective that, yes, MSU Extension is the organization that I am employed by, I work with, I work for, but I also know that tribal nations are part of that decision maker for what I do as well. I always go back to the tribes to ask, is this appropriate to share? Are these materials fitting your needs? Is there something I ought not talk about that might be too sensitive to share? Be it traditional medicines, be it a governing document, be it a discussion about historical trauma. So really much, if not all of my work is steered and governed by what the needs are of our Anishinaabe communities and Indigenous people here in Michigan. And I will transfer to Steve.
Thank you very much, Emily. As we're gathered around the fire, as Emily described it, keep in mind that one of the things we need to understand is that we're on Indian time now. So things begin when they begin and they end when they end. And that's one of the things we have to understand as we work with people who have different ways of doing things, is that we truly need to spend time with one another, understand one another's ways of living and ways of getting things done. And that's okay. Represented with the slide that you see in front of you, and I'd like to recognize all of our colleagues at all of the 12 tribal nations represented and with this slide, the different logos that you see. The smaller logos are the 12 tribal nations in the state of Michigan. Michigan has 7 tribal nations in lower Michigan and 5 tribal nations in upper Michigan. Also represented in this slide are the 4 land grant institutions in the state of Michigan. And that's something that's been important for us to recognize as well, is that yes, everyone or many people are familiar with our 1862 partner, Michigan State University, but our tribal colleges are also recognized as land grant institutions. We only go back a few years though as tribal colleges and universities, and that's something that's important to recognize when our 1862 partners are trying to understand who we are. I'm older than the oldest tribal college, and I'm not that old. So understanding the short amount of time that tribal colleges and universities have been engaged in higher education in general, and as land grant institutions specifically. So we have 4 tribal colleges, or 3 tribal colleges in the state of Michigan, Bay Mills Community College, Keweenaw Bay Ojibwe Community College, and Saginaw Chippewa Tribal College. And as we sit around the fire, we all recognize that we respect one another. We provide each other with equal time to share their needs and share their goals. The fire, in terms of the sacred notion of the fire, is important for us as colleagues to understand what that means. Those are the folks whom we're working with. We understand where each of us is in terms of the land bases that support us and nourish us, and that's important as we move forward. So Emily, back to you.
Sure, Miigwech. So we talk about sustainability. The Integrated Michigan Land Grant Team has been created is to ensure the ability to increase and improve the impact of extension, education, and research activities and partnerships with tribal nations and tribal colleges and communities. In addition to neighbors, right? We also know that we work with many non-government entities, nonprofits, municipalities, right? How can we also support efforts to build that collegiality, to build the understanding of what it means to partner and work with tribal college, tribal nations, and communities? This also includes the ability to train and develop Native American talent, right? Anishinaabe and Indigenous talent to be employed by the land grant system. We continue to build our competence as a team to bring our authentic selves as well to our work, to be accountable and reliable to others, and ensure we are doing all we can to be transparent in all aspects of this initiative. Again, we continually strive to approach this work with humility. There are multiple ways of knowing and ways to engage with tribal nations and communities, but we must be willing and able to become comfortable within a less defined, fluid environment. Thus, the Michigan Land Grant FIRE, which this equals the land grant family, and in my homelands, the Michigan Intertribal Land Grant Extension System. Steve?
Thank you, Emily. So how do we plan to continue this work? At the forefront of our plans for developing a solid foundation for the future in the state of Michigan is the development of relationships. Relationships take time. Relationships, if they're meaningful relationships, aren't going to happen overnight. So what do? Emily and I have traveled to every tribal nation in the state of Michigan. That took an awful lot of time, but those relationships can only be developed if we take the time to meet our tribal nation partners where they are within their tribal nations. Also, as part of the relationship building is helping the tribal nations understand who we are. Don't assume that tribal nations understand what the land grant system is. In fact, assume that they probably don't. So what we needed to do was help them understand why we were coming to visit them, what the land grant system is, and why it's important that we take the time to share with them what we are as land grant institutions. Relationships, if properly established, eliminate or reduce some of the past challenges. We've all had the experience as tribal colleges of having someone call us on Thursday to seek information for a grant proposal that's due on Friday. Building relationships eliminates that. In fact, just last week, a non-land grant entity contacted us and that exact same thing happened. Hey, can you help us? We have a proposal due tomorrow. Can you provide us with this information? Well, no, if you had taken the time to develop a relationship with us, you would never do that to us, right? We would treat each other with greater respect. Another thing that relationships develop is an understanding of the interests of all engaged partners. Don't assume that everyone's interested in something just because you are, or that's a focus for you. Relationships also eliminate, or hopefully reduce at least, paternalistic attitudes, paternalistic language that we see sometimes out there. They also reduce the awkwardness of the unknown. Emily asked you a question, how many folks have attended a powwow or other tribal event or activity? Well, in so doing, hopefully you feel less awkward in terms of engaging with tribal communities and tribal partners, because you've taken the time to engage with tribal nations and tribal people where they are. Mature relationships provide for shared decision-making and respect for various points of view and capacities, recognizing that tribal colleges have very different capacities than 1862s or 1890s, recognizing that different tribal nations have different capacities and different histories. As Emily pointed out, there are different structures of government, recognizing that not every tribal nation is the same or will approach you with the same level of understanding or interest in moving forward. Mature relationships have shared responsibility and shared workloads. We're not here just to benefit one group. We're here to have all groups benefit from the interactions that we have with one another, whether that's doing the work or sharing knowledge. Mature relationships know and respect history, but don't let history interfere with positive collaborations today and tomorrow. During the early days of the development of the Michigan Intertribal Land Grant Extension System, we had the opportunity to hear about the history of tribal nations. We brought in a speaker who is well versed in the history of tribal nations in the state of Michigan. We all learned together and understood what that history was. I've seen examples over the years of meetings involving tribal college representatives in 1862s. And sometimes the tribal college representatives are still very angry and they just can't get past some of the negative things that have happened in the past. We do not ignore those, but we must make sure that in order to move forward, we have to look at those negative historical events and activities in the light of the history, but don't let them get in the way of us moving forward together. Mature relationships respect the knowledge base and contributions of all parties. It's a two-way street. Tribal nations sharing with our land grant system and our land grant system sharing with our tribal nations. We saw an example fairly recently with respect to food safety practices and methods. You know, the extension system has food safety practices that we all know and understand. Tribal nations have food safety practices as well that should be shared with the land grant system. And both ways of knowing, both ways of doing should be respected and understood. Mature relationships don't shy away from controversy or differences of opinion, recognizing within our team that sometimes we have different ways of looking at the world. Sometimes we have different values, but that doesn't mean that we devalue one another because we have different ways of looking at things and different understandings of how we move together. We want Miles to stand the test of time. This is not simply an activity that's based on individual people who happen to be working at this time or individual grant projects that we happen to be working on. We're laying a foundation based on trust, solid, mature relationships, sharing of resources, and showing one another best practices where we are to move forward for the future here in the state of Michigan. Emily, anything to share on any of those issues?
No, Steve, you said that very eloquently.
Thank you. So we wanted to share with you now some of the voices of our partners and co-workers over the years. We're going to share some quotes that we've recognized as important quotes as we work together over the past many years. So Emily will share the first quote, and these quotes hopefully will help you understand some of the important motivations that we've developed over the years.
During our travels and meeting with each tribal nation and tribal leaders, one particular quote stood out from a Michigan tribal leader. Quote, "We just want to be at the table."
Thank you, Emily. Another quote, and the context for this quote is, I was sitting at a breakfast table with our immediate past president here at BMCC, a gentleman by the name of Mickey Parrish, and the associate extension director at Michigan State University, a friend and colleague named Patrick Cudney. And we had many discussions and meetings about partnerships and collaborations over the years, over the past 25 years, really. And the quote from our former president is this: "I guess MSU Extension is serious about this now after putting money on the table." So again, the context was MSU Extension came to us and said, "Hey, we're going to provide resources for you to help you engage in this work, that because we think it's important." You may be familiar with the term earnest money from contracts, maybe in real estate. You know, when a person puts earnest money up front, it's recognized that this is serious, this is going to happen now. And that's where this shared resources really on the table allowed us to understand the seriousness that MSU Extension was now engaging this work.
To follow along that same vein, if you will, my associate director of MSU Extension, Patrick Cudney, had stated this quote as we were moving forward with the Miles effort and the Miles grant. And I want to also say that he and I have worked together since I've joined MSU Extension, and he was my regional director, has changed positions, and continues to be also a strong supporter, trusted colleague, and great person to deliberate these very difficult conversations with at times. Why are we doing this? Because we can and should. Tribal nations and colleges have a right to be there. We assist them with providing those resources and programs based on their needs. Miles will continue regardless of additional external funding.
Thank you, Emily. And the last quote that we'll share with you comes from my friend and colleague, Emily Proctor, who, as a very humble person, probably isn't too crazy about me sharing a quote that I picked up from her over the years, but here it is. All of us are in relationship. We need to find a way to be in an equitable relationship with tribal nations. Uphold tribal sovereignty by upholding tribal knowledge, traditions, values, and self-governance. And again, that quote comes from Emily Proctor, a tribal extension educator with Michigan State University.
So with that, I believe that concludes our presentation at this time. So Chima Gwach for listening and joining with us in our journey.
All right, thank you for that presentation, Michigan. And before we move on to the next slide, we are going to go into a discussion component. So just a reminder, any questions that you have come up, please do use the Q&A box to post those for the presenters, and we'll get around to those. But we did have one question that came through the chat box. Emily or Steve asking about this slide that you have up right now and what this process is based upon again.
So Steve, please jump in as well. So here at least from my teachings, and I want to give a disclaimer to that, I have my teachings from elders from my communities and nations. However, you talk with other Anishinaabe people and other indigenous people and those who work and reside within tribal territories, you will receive multiple perspectives and diverse teachings as well, though you see similar themes. So for me, the circle and the fire itself is very important. The fire is denoted throughout history in our oral teachings, but also you'll see in some history, some places where you find accurate history, that the fire represents a place of communication, a place of deliberation. There's no beginning, there's no end, that it's a way that speaks to those around it, but also to those in other realms. It's a way to connect with our ancestors who might have passed on, and it's used in many sacred ceremonial places. So there are many teachings about fire, to which my teaching is also, you don't share those until wintertime. So that's our storytelling time. And so for the circle, similar in fashion, everyone has an equal place. Everyone has a role. It can grow, it can get smaller, but everyone has a way and a place, a seat at that table, at that fire, at that ring. So that can also be applied to seasons, to when things ought to occur. In our communities, you have times of hunting, fishing, gathering, of preparing, times where certain ceremonies occur. So much is based on a cyclical fashion. And so you'll notice around that too, there are various words that we deploy, and trust, collaboration, modeling, and resources. Those are all circling us and surrounding us in the work that we do, kept in our minds. Steve, is there anything else you'd like to share, please?
Yes, thank you, Emily. What comes to mind for me is that when we're gathered at the circle or at the fire, it doesn't matter who pays us to do the work we're doing. We are all colleagues working together to bring the land grant extension system to tribal nations, tribal citizens, and tribal organizations. We are all colleagues in the same effort. We may work for different institutions, but when we gather around the fire, that really doesn't matter. What matters is that we are colleagues. We are working together with the same goals within our state to try and bring the resources of the land grant system to our tribal nations and try to develop relationships with our tribal nations that are based on trust and respect. And you cannot separate the tribal colleges and universities from the tribal nations. That also comes to mind as I look at this graphic. You know, the tribal nations really drive the tribal colleges in terms of what their priorities are for the tribal colleges, especially with the land grant activities at the tribal colleges. In this particular graphic, we've developed a logo for the Michigan Intertribal Land Grant Extension System that's really based on this graphic that you see in front of you, although we've taken out the tribal nation logos because it's not our place to use those logos. But we do have permission to use the logos from the 4 land grant institutions, as we recognize that we are all working together in the state of Michigan and with one unified land grant system.
All right, thank you, Steve and Emily. A question for all of you. At the beginning of the Texas presentation, Carolyn shone a light on how 1890 HBCUs have been historically underfunded, which has implications for overall capacity. And this is true of 1994 tribal colleges and universities as well. I think all of you touched on this throughout your presentations, but can you take a moment to dig deeper into how 1862s and even other institutions can build partnerships with 1890s and 1994s to overcome this systemic inequity? Maybe we can start out with Texas. Some thoughts on that.
Well, we do have a very good working relationship with our 1862 colleagues here in Texas, Texas AgriLife. I mean, and of course, because I was part of that family from 4-H through 18 years as an extension agent, that relationship, you know, was built there. We have written several grants together as well. Our staff are housed in the same offices with them. So it's just, we just have to continue to work at it, because when you look at the state of Texas and the number of people who really need extension so bad, we still have not made a dent. And it will continue. Partnerships, collaborations, resources, that's what it will take. And we just have to stay with it and not give up and not give in.
Thank you, Carolyn. Anyone else from Texas want to add on to what Carolyn shared?
I think she targeted all of the areas, because even in 4-H, FCH, we also have grants with our partnerships within Texas.
And then Michigan, any thoughts on that?
I think oftentimes when we talk about inequities, we're talking about funding, we're talking about resources. And there's no doubt that there are differences in terms of the support that we receive to do the land grant work. But we have different resources and different capacities. Without collaborating with tribal colleges and tribal nations, you know, MSU Extension, or our 1862, has limited access sometimes to tribal nations, and we can provide that access. We can provide the understanding that's necessary to be successful. We can provide access to tribal departments. We can provide access to tribal leadership. We can provide understanding of history and lifeways that might be very difficult for our 1862 partner to access without working with us. You know, clearly we know that our 1862s have, you know, the capacities that we don't have in terms of dollars and people on the ground and research opportunities and so forth. But that's okay, because, you know, they have a different audience sometimes with whom they're working. But we can provide them with access to tribal communities, and that's one of the the resources that we have that we think is very, very important as well. So there are a lot of different resources that you can talk about. And we like to talk about the resources that we do have and can share as ways to strengthen these relationships.
Emily, anything that you want to jump in with?
Sure. And from the 1862 perspective, I think it takes the leadership, it takes individuals to know that just because we have access to some of those greater resources and materials and capacity, it also creates more of a responsibility and also an understanding that it's the right thing to do, as I stated earlier, to ensure that 1994's, if I had a 1890 around me as well, that I make sure that those resources, to the best of my ability, are open and available. And if they are not meeting the needs, trying my darndest to make sure those are brought to the forefront of my organization. So again, granted, there is an increase in those resources and capacity. However, with that comes a greater responsibility as well.
Thank you, Emily. So we are already at the end of our webinar. There's so much rich information shared here about collaborations across the land-grant university system that we don't have time to pose any more questions. However, thank you to all of our presenters today, Jacqueline, Steve, Carolyn, Jana, and Emily, for taking the time out today to talk to all of us about how to build trust and create collaborative partnerships across the land-grant university system. With that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Rich to close us out.
Thank you, Kalia. And I'll ask Rachel to advance to the final slide. One more. So for those of you that are interested, and I'd ask Rachel if you'd put this link in the chat pod. The previous webinars and resources on racial equity in the food system. This is actually the 11th webinar we've done since 2018 that focuses on racial equity in the food system. Actually, Kalia, maybe you could put that in the chat pod because I think Rachel can't do it because she's sharing the screen. But we have a number of webinars just like the one we've had today on various topics at the intersection of food systems and racial equity, and with many of them have a focus on the partnerships with cooperative extension, higher education, and elevate many of the points that you heard here today about the need for moving at the speed of trust and building trust, transparency, listening, to be able to build relationships over the long term. So we want to thank you for participating. All the people that participated today and all our registrants, we had over 220 registrants, will be sent the webinar recording for today, as well as the slides that we use within 3 to 5 working days. So on behalf of Kalia for her facilitation, and behind the scenes, Rachel for managing the slides, and all of our presenters and discussants today, we wish you all peace and health and continued being able to build your relationships at the speed of trust for the betterment of all the people that you work with. So with that, we will end the recording and wish you well on the rest of your journey for today.